Okay, here we go. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna start with a little poll. So pre-ETS, VRS must spend what percentage of the federal funds on pre-ETS? Let me launch this poll. Okay, you guys are fast and you're accurate. So the answer is 15%. So we need to spend 15% of our federal funds on pre-ETS. So great job there. Our learning objectives for today, and this is in your participant handout that I sent you. It's on your first page. But we're going to know the state and VRS policies for purchasing pre-ETS services. We're going to use correct procedures when making those purchases. We're going to know where to find information and tools to assist us in purchasing decisions and authorizations. And we're going to know where to find contracts with CRP and LUV vendors to verify services and fees. We need staff to demonstrate these basic competencies to follow these procedures in order to authorize purchases for participants. Our RAMs, our managers, have oversight authority, and the FOSs, there's a FOS assigned to each region statewide. We conduct regular reviews of purchases to make sure that we're in compliance with those fiscal procedures. So before we dive deeply into each topic, we want to briefly define some key terms and concepts related to purchasing and our responsibilities in managing VR funds. Then we'll go into more depth about what these mean and how they apply to purchasing services and goods. So why are fiscal procedures important? VRS is a federal and state program with limited resources. We need to have responsible stewardship, and what that really means is just having good documentation that substantiates the need and rationale for every purchase that we make. We also have to maintain ethical standards for procuring services and ensure fairness to our vendors and to businesses. We also serve individual by individual. So each person that we work with has a unique need. So you'll often notice that we don't provide or authorize the same service to every participant because each person might need something different. So we accommodate for those differences. We are also accountable for every dollar that we spend, and our program is audited by federal and state authorities. And we need to ensure that we manage the funds in a way that allows us to serve as many people as possible. So what is purchasing authority? So part of your role in the experience for potentially eligible students is to work with our providers to purchase pre-ETS. This training is being held so you have an understanding of the purchasing rules that need to be followed in order to be compliant with purchasing rules declared by the state of Minnesota and VRS. Purchasing authority really just means that you can authorize for services, and when you receive an invoice, you can approve that invoice for payment. The RAM delegates purchasing authority to each of their staff. Completion of purchasing training is required, and competency in purchasing procedures is required. And then after the training, your manager, along with the FOS, will kind of have a discussion, and they'll determine when they can grant you that purchasing authority. So signature authority, what this means is it's the ability to approve or sign off on invoices that are received. So signature authority is only granted to staff who have completed this training and demonstrated competency in using purchasing procedures correctly. You should not sign off on any invoices until signature authority has been delegated to you by your manager. There is a form that needs to be completed by you and your manager, and that form is sent to the field operations specialist to document the delegation. So if you look at your handout on page 2, you'll see these 5 big concepts. So this is really what our focus of today is going to be about. We're going to talk about prior encumbrance. We're going to talk a little bit about consumer financial participation, or CFP. We're going to talk about the contracts with our providers. We're going to talk about how we authorize for pre-ETS services. And then finally, we're going to talk about how we process the invoices that we receive. So that first major concept is prior encumbrance. We need to have an authorization in place before we purchase goods or services. So encumber just means that we're setting that money aside for those individuals. So we have to encumber our funds or create the authorization in Workforce One before we purchase any goods or services. The second concept is consumer financial participation. As you are working with participants and VR staff, you may hear reference to CFP. For eligible participants, there are some services that require the participant to contribute financially based on their income. For potentially eligible participants, purchasing is limited to specific pre-ETS service types, and CFP does not apply to these. The third concept is about contracts. So we have professional technical, or PT, contracts that are used to purchase pre-ETS services from vendors. We're going to go into much more detail later about this. We also have state contracts that we have in place for certain types of goods and services, and this can make our purchasing process easier. That fourth big concept is about authorizing, and we're going to go into much more detail, but when we're thinking about authorizing, there are a couple of key concepts we need to keep in mind. We need to think about communication with the provider, what is included in the hours that are authorized. We have an hourly rate, and all pre-ETS services are authorized at $75 an hour, and we need to be mindful of the authorization end dates. That last big concept is processing invoices. And again, we're going to go into much more detail, but when we think about processing invoices, there are a couple of key concepts we need to keep in mind. We need to make sure we're comparing the invoices to the reports that we receive. The dates on the invoice and the dates on the report must match. Reports need to show if the service was provided to an individual or a group. And when reviewing reports for travel, we need to see the starting and ending locations. These are some general principles that will apply to almost every type of purchase we're going to discuss today. So we purchase pre-ETS from community partners that have a contract with VRS. Every contract outlines the services that each community partner offers. And the majority of pre-ETS auxiliary aids will be purchased from a state contract. And those are things like cart services, interpreters, video remote interpreting, things like that. So are there any questions so far about these 5 concepts that we're going to cover today? Okay, I'm going to keep going. So we're going to start with the first concept, which is prior encumbrance. The number one thing you need to know as a state employee is that you cannot buy anything without encumbering the funds for the purchase beforehand. We'll be discussing this next. So we have a Minnesota state statute that we follow. It's Minnesota Statute 16A, and you might have heard the term an MS-16. What Minnesota Statute 16A requires is that we encumber the funds before we purchase a service or a good for a participant. If we fail to encumber the funds, then we have a violation. We violated that Minnesota state statute. If it's discovered that funds were not prior encumbered, the supervisor must be consulted prior to committing funds to the vendor or the participant. The supervisor will determine if an MS-16 violation approval exception will be pursued. And if the supervisor approves pursuing an MS-16 violation exception, staff will complete the VRS purchasing violation form. So the violation form requires that we complete an MS-16 purchasing violation reporting form. And what that does, it explains why the error occurred and how we're going to avoid that error in the future. And there are complete instructions on how to complete the electronic purchasing violation form. It's out on SharePoint in our field operations manual, and there's an entire chapter dedicated to it, chapter 214. So now is time for an activity. So if you go to your participant handout on page 3, there are 3 purchasing violation scenarios. What I want you to do is review each scenario, and I'm going to launch a poll, and you'll be able to indicate, was the scenario a violation or not? Completing the poll just lets me know when you've had enough time to review it. So I am going to get that started. So go ahead and work on those 3 scenarios. For the recording, I'm going to pause the recording and we will come back in a few minutes. Okay, we are going to end the poll and we are going to review okay. Okay, can you see, I'm sorry, can someone just give me a thumbs up or let me know that you can see the scenarios on the screen?
Can see it.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so scenario 1 is Molly. She met with Phil, who works for a community partner, for her first meeting on March 15th. The VRS pre-ETS rehab rep worked with the support staff in the local office to create that first authorization on March 16th. So the majority of you thought that this was a purchasing violation. Does anyone want to give a little more information about what went wrong? Why is it a violation?
This is Amy. The meeting occurred before the authorization is valid for.
Exactly. So in that situation, to avoid the MS-16, we would have had to have the authorization in place on or before March 15th. So scenario 2 is about Sarah. She's the VR pre-ETS rehab rep. She's reviewing an invoice submitted from a community partner. The invoice showed 2 hours of job exploration counseling provided on January 20th. And the only authorization created in Workforce One is for instruction and self-advocacy that has a start date of January 27th. So again, the majority of you agreed that this is a purchasing violation. Does anyone want to give a little bit more about what went wrong with this scenario?
Meeting was before and wrong service.
Exactly. So we did have an authorization, but the authorization wasn't in place until almost a week later, and it was for an entirely different service. And then the final scenario, number 3, is about Ray. He's our student. He needs assistance with 1 hour of transportation with an employer for a job shadow on February 18th. He's working with a community partner. The VR tech created an authorization for 5 hours of work-based learning, which included 2 hours of transportation on February 14th. And the majority of you agreed that this was not a violation, and it isn't. In that situation, we had an authorization in place before the service happened, and there were hours to cover that travel. So good job. Any questions about prior encumbrance? Okay. We are going to keep moving. And if someone can just give me a thumbs up that they see my PowerPoint now. Thank you, Susan. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Okay. So now we're going to transition and we're going to talk about purchasing services. Oh, and Megan has her hand up. Do you have a question, Megan?
No, I was trying to get my hand down.
Oh, no worries. Thank you. Okay. So we have primary services that we offer for pre-ETS. They are pre-ETS auxiliary aids, pre-ETS instruction and self-advocacy, pre-ETS job exploration counseling, pre-ETS post-secondary education counseling, pre-ETS work-based learning, and pre-ETS workplace readiness training. So I'm sure you are all familiar with this awesome desk aid. We call it our pre-ETS desk aid. The column on the far right, this is where the pre-ETS services that we can authorize are displayed. So you'll see it kind of indicates the different pre-ETS services, and then it shows you what services can be authorized underneath each service type. So that's a nice little desk aid that I refer to frequently. So the PT contracts, we can only purchase pre-ETS services from CARF accredited providers or from non-CARF accredited providers who have a contract with VRS. And CARF is the Commission on Rehabilitation Facilities, and it certifies that the provider meets specific standards of quality in providing vocational services. VRS has contracts with community rehabilitation programs, we call them CRPs, or limited use vendors, we call them LUVs. The contracts outline the services that are available or offered from each vendor, and it indicates the fee for each service. All CRPs have contracts with VRS to provide services. The contracts are managed by the VRS administrative staff. Ann Paulson is one of the specialists who works with both CRPs and LUVs to monitor, revise, and update contracts for job-related services. Some of the other staff that you might know of in that PT contract group are Sarah Sundin, Jess Othwaite, and Janine Oyen. So those are kind of our go-to staff about those contracts with the community partners. We also have limited use vendors, and really what that means is a limited use vendor can earn up to $200,000 from VRS authorizations over a 2-year time period. So the CRPs, they don't really have a spending limit. We can create authorizations for, unlimited funds, essentially. LUVs, they're not CARF accredited, so we have to limit our spending with those providers. So it's just something that we like staff to be aware of, that there is a difference between a CRP vendor and an LUV vendor. And it's about the accreditation and it's about the spending limits. So when you're looking at PT contracts, you're going to notice that every contract has a start date and an end date. Right now, all of our CRP contracts expire on June 30th of 2022. So when we created the contracts, we created them to be good for a 5-year period. LUV contracts, a lot of them expire June 30th of 2021. So when we're authorizing services to providers, we need to be aware of the contract end dates. You'll notice, and I'm going to go out and show you this, but often contracts with the providers are amended. So sometimes they add services, remove services, sometimes fees get updated. So I'm going to show you where we keep track of all of that information. So I am going to navigate to SharePoint. Here we go. Make it a little bigger. Okay, so this is SharePoint. This is our internal website. It's just for VR staff. You'll notice on the left navigation, we have a link that says Community Partners. So when I click on this link, you're going to see I have a lot of different options. What I always direct staff to is this link kind of down at the bottom. It says PT Contracts Easy Sort List. So someone has a question, what do IL centers fall under? Similar to an LUV? It's a good question. The IL centers, I believe, let's see. A lot of them will be classified as an LUV. So like this is the Center for Independent Living for Northern Minnesota. So you'll notice on this easy sort list, it gives you a column that kind of indicates, is the vendor a CRP or an LUV? So for, I would say the majority of the independent living centers, I'm just gonna go try to find one more. Let's see, Metro, MCIL, yes, LUV. So they are kind of classified in that LUV status. So when we come out here to the community partners page, what you're going to notice is that we have the list of all of the vendors statewide listed alphabetically. So it'll give you the name of the vendor, a link to their contract. It gives you their vendor number, which is important when we create the authorizations. It lets you know that designation of CRP or LUV, and then it shows you their contract number. Now, we've automated a lot of this in Workforce One. So when you're creating authorizations, Workforce One knows what the contract number is, and it also knows when the contracts expire. But it's always good to just come out here and take a peek at that as well. And then to the far right, you'll notice the start date and end dates for the contracts. So when I click on the contract, it opens this page and it brings me right to the fee for service schedule, which this is the part of the contract that says, these are the services that this vendor is allowed to provide. So this is what we can create authorizations for. It'll show you the effective date of the contract. So this contract was amended from the original one. So on January 12th, they must have changed or added to this contract. The first part of the contract or this fee page is for the general services. So these are for the eligible VR participants. These are the different services that this vendor offers along with their rates. If you keep scrolling, the pre-ETS services are always kind of on the second or third page of that fee statement. So here for pre-ETS, it will show the different pre-ETS services. And it should be noted that not all vendors provide every type of pre-ETS service. I will say there are a majority that do, but there are some that do not offer all of them. So it's important to review the contracts to make sure. You'll notice it shows the different pre-ETS service types, services, and then it'll show you the individual rate and the group rate. So that was called the PT contract easy sort list. So I'm just going to review how we got there again. So on SharePoint, I went to this link for community partners. And then I went here, PT contracts easy sort list. The other thing I want to show you is this one, pre-ETS services by partner. So sometimes you're working with participants and maybe you know they need a specific pre-ETS service, but you're not sure which vendors offer that service. This page lets you filter by the service. So for example, if I was working with someone and I knew that they needed post-secondary education counseling, I can come here and I can filter this to say yes. And now it will show me all of the vendors that have that service on their contract. You kind of just scroll through and you can see those. So does anyone have any questions so far? I do see a couple more in the chat. So there was that question about, do the IL centers fall under like similar to an LUV? We established that yes. And then it said, so the same cap, yes, they would have the same funding limits as an LUV. And then another question in the chat, is travel at $75 an hour? That is correct. For pre-ETS, we authorize everything at the $75 an hour rate. So if you go to your handout, pull it over here. On page 4, you're going to see this activity, job-related services, authorizing services with CRPs and LUVs. I have 9 questions. So I want you to take some time, go out to SharePoint, review, either through the easy sort list or from that pre-ETS services by provider, and indicate, does that provider offer this pre-ETS service? I'm going to launch a poll. Again, this is just so I have an idea of how we're doing, if everybody's had enough time to complete the scenarios. So for the purposes of the recording, I am going to pause the recording and we're going to come back in a few minutes. And then I will recording. Okay. And it looks like I missed some conversation in the chat. So I'm going to go over to the chat for a second. So is travel at $75 an hour for pre-ETS? The potentially eligible, yes, it's at $75 an hour. And then is travel at a lower rate through a counselor? So yes, so when you're reviewing the contracts, there is transportation to the provider that can be authorized, and that's done at a $28 per hour rate. So that's for services outside of pre-ETS. So you guys were kind of talking about that in the chat, and you're right on. So the $28 per hour, that's for those general services that we authorize for the eligible participants. So it looks like we got that all sorted out. So I might just let me share my screen again. And I'm gonna just pull up a contract for you. And this is where you'll see the different rate for the general services. So transportation, it says reimbursement for providers, but that's on there at $28 an hour. Okay, and then it says they should be detailing their starting location and ending location. And we can verify time via Google Maps. I did this for one vendor who charged a half hour for a trip back and return. We didn't think it would take that long, but Google Maps confirmed it. So yes, when we're authorizing for the travel time, we do it based on the time that it takes, but we don't account for construction, weather. So on any given day, if I was authorizing for a provider to get from, St. Paul to Bloomington, and let's say it's 10 o'clock in the morning, traffic should be relatively light. If the Google Maps says to get from St. Paul to Bloomington is 20 minutes, that's the baseline we're going to use. Now, if the vendor ran into construction or it's the middle of winter and there's a bad snowstorm and that 20 minutes took 40 minutes, we don't adjust for those types of things. So it's kind of, ideal conditions, this is how long it should take. Someone said I'm surprised it's not paid by mileage. We used to pay the providers by the miles, and then there was lots of discussion and the contracts were changed and the payment method was changed to this hourly rate. Okay, so I hope that answers or clarifies the transportation piece. I see a comment, it would be nice to have a document detailing transportation related to pre-ETS and some scenarios. And I think we do have something like that. So we're going to review some resources later in this training. So we'll see if it's there. But let's kind of dig into these scenarios. So we had 9 different scenarios. So number 1 was how many vendors that start with the letter O have pre-ETS job exploration counseling on their contract. The majority of you got this one. There's 4 providers. So there are 4 providers that start with the letter O that have job exploration counseling on their contract. The second question, does HDC offer pre-ETS job exploration counseling? You guys are rock stars. You all got this one correct. Yes, they do. Number 3, does CSD Works offer pre-ETS workplace readiness training? Again, the majority of you got this one. No, they do not. They do not. CSD Works does not have pre-ETS workplace readiness on their contract. Number 4, does Blended Youth and Family Services offer pre-ETS work experience wages? The answer there was no. The majority of you got that one. Number 5, does Career Solutions offer pre-ETS introductory work activities? Everybody got this one. Yes, they do. Number 6, does Winona ORC offer pre-ETS job exploration counseling? No, they do not. And then number 7, does Blue Sky offer pre-ETS instruction and self-advocacy? The answer to that one was no as well. They do not have that service on their contract. So then number 8, Brayshawn is a student that meets pre-ETS criteria, and he's going to complete retail skills training with Goodwill Easter Seals. What is the total amount we would authorize for that training? Does anyone want to unmute and shout out your answer?
This is Sue. I got $3,250.
Exactly, yes. So that retail skills training would be $3,250. And then what would the pre-ETS services authorized be? Anyone wants to unmute and share?
Workplace readiness and work experience services.
Exactly. So yes, on that PT contract, they split that training between 2 different pre-ETS services, and they were workplace readiness and work experience services. So then the last question, Michelle is a student that meets the pre-ETS criteria, and she is going to complete the college prep boot camp with Fraser. What is the total dollar amount we could create the authorization for? Anyone want to unmute and share their answer?
This is Sue again. I got the total dollar amount, $1,500 and $1,575. And it's for self-advocacy, post-secondary, and workplace readiness.
Exactly. Yes. And I'm seeing some thumbs up. People are agreeing with you. Yes. So that college prep boot camp was 21 hours, and we would authorize them at $75 an hour. So that gives us a total of $1,575. And there were the services, instruction and self-advocacy, post-secondary education counseling, and workplace readiness. So any questions about the PT contracts before we kind of move on to the next topic? Okay. Okay, so we are going to move on. We're going to get through this section that I've called authorizing pre-ETS. And once we get through this, then we'll take a little break. So before we're authorizing, the key thing that we need to do is we need to have a conversation with the provider about what the individual needs. So the number of hours that we're going to authorize has to be discussed with the community partner. During that discussion, we're going to talk about how many hours for the service are needed, how many hours for prep time, and how many hours for travel. And in your role as the pre-ETS rehab rep, you're going to be entering a case note to document that discussion with the provider about the number of hours that were agreed upon for the service time, the prep time, and the travel time. So what is included in each of those hours? So for service time, it includes the time for the first meeting, employer development time, and team meetings. So just to expand on that a little more, the service time is providing the actual service. So, if it's job exploration counseling, it's providing that service. It's that first meeting time, which could be the time for the provider to meet with the student. That's how they get to know them. For potentially eligible, we talk about this as the first meeting. As you guys are working with staff that are working with eligible participants, they call that meeting an intake. So for potentially eligible, we just call it the first meeting. Employer development time, that's the time for the provider to make phone calls, send emails, visit work-based learning opportunities. They do internet searches. This is really their time to develop the sites for the different types of activities that your participant might be having through that service provision. And then team meetings, this is so the provider can attend a meeting. This includes IEP meetings with the students. It could also be other types of meetings with family, VRS, school staff, county case managers. And it's really meant for them to be able to report on the progress of the pre-ET services. So then someone asked, is employer development time the same as prep time? No, they're kind of two different things. Prep time is, and I believe this is on my next slide. Prep time is for the vendor to prepare and revise lesson plans. So if they're offering, you know, a group setting, a class session, it's for them to prepare those lesson plans. It could also be for them to prepare content for one-on-one sessions. It's really for them to get their materials ready. It could also include communication or attempted communication with the student, parent, or school to get meetings set or plan or coordinate for services. And then the prep time can also include time to edit resumes, cover letters, and other documents. So they are a little different. I'd say the employer development time is really the time for them to develop the different sites for like a work experience, a job shadow, things like that. So I hope that answers that question. And then travel time. Travel time is really the round trip time to travel from their primary work location to where the services to the student or group of students is going to be provided. It can include time for the provider to pick up and drop off students. What's not included in the hours that you're going to authorize? Community partners cannot invoice for their time to write reports, prepare invoices, or no-show fees. Again, all authorizations have the same hourly rate. So if you're authorizing something for an individual or for a group, you're always going to create the authorization at $75 an hour. If the pre-ET services are provided to a group, which means 2 or more students, we still authorize them at $75 an hour. But when we receive the invoice, the vendor is going to invoice us at the group rate, which is $30 an hour. So we authorize at $75 across the board, just in case, because what if you authorize something at a group rate and then it's supposed to be a group of 2 and one of the people doesn't show up? It's just, it kind of makes things a little easier on our authorizing end, so everything is consistent. So I have a question. Can I repeat the no-show fee? So yeah, let me back up a slide here. So the community partner cannot invoice us for a no-show fee. And then it says, I read somewhere that they can invoice for the travel for a no-show. And yes, you're right on track. So if you created an authorization, let's say for instruction in self-advocacy, and the vendor had a meeting scheduled at 9 a.m. and the participant did not show up to the meeting, they can't bill a no-show for the meeting time. But if they had to travel to meet the person, they can bill their travel, but they just can't bill the time for the actual meeting. If they sat and waited for the person for 15 minutes, they can't bill that time. So I hope that clarifies that. Okay, so when we're thinking about the authorizing, we have different budgets in Workforce One. Sorry, I'm kind of looking at the chat and trying to get through. Okay, so did the vendors get this info in this detail? So we have shared with the providers the information that I'm sharing with you. So when we get later in the presentation, we have some different resources. And one of them is an authorizing invoicing reporting guide. And that has been shared with the community partners. And that kind of is your go-to document about the things that we've been talking about. So we'll review that in just a little bit. Okay, so the different VR budgets. For purposes of the work that you're doing with the potentially eligible students, there's only one budget available to you, and it's called the pre-ETS referral budget. And this is the budget that we're tracking to make sure that we're spending that 15% on pre-ETS. So no less than 15% of our federal funds must be spent on pre-ETS. In order to track our spending, we created a special budget called the pre-ETS referral. So when you're creating authorizations in Workforce One, this is the only budget that you're going to see. And then the other thing we want to make sure we all understand are the different budget dates. So there are some general principles that are going to apply to almost every type of purchase we're going to be talking about today. Our authorizations have to follow the federal and the state fiscal year. And you might also hear us reference the program year. So the federal fiscal year, this is where our budget, our money comes from. So we are a federally funded program, and the federal funds are issued on a calendar from October 1st through September 30th. So right now we're in federal fiscal year 21. We also, because we're a state agency, we have to be mindful of the state fiscal year. So the state fiscal year runs from July 1st through June 30th. So that state fiscal year is going to end next week. And next week on July 1st, we're going to start state fiscal year 22. And then the program year, this, we talk a lot about the program year. This is for performance measures and things like that. That follows the same calendar as the state fiscal year, which is July 1st through June 30th. So when we're creating authorizations, we have to be mindful of the dates of service. So all of our pre-ETS authorizations are going to have one of the following end dates. And you'll notice they're quarterly. So March 31st, June 30th, September 30th, or December 31st. So when we're authorizing, we need to be mindful of these end dates. So right now, when we're authorizing for pre-ETS services, the majority of them are an hourly service. So we need to end them on June 30th because of the end of the state fiscal year. Now, next week, we're going to start creating new authorizations for July 1st. So services that start on July 1st, we're going to authorize those, but we have to end them on September 30th because that's the end of the federal fiscal year. So just being aware of those two dates, June 30th and September 30th. So we ask staff to choose the closest end date or the one after that. This, I'll be honest, this doesn't really apply right now because we have to honor the end of the state fiscal year and the end of the federal fiscal year. But come, let's say October, when you're authorizing, we always want you to try to end it on the quarter end date. But we know sometimes, the service is going to go beyond the quarter. So when you're authorizing, for example, in October, we would ask you to either end your authorization on December 31st or March 31st. So that's kind of what we're trying to say there. There's a little example. If you have a service starting in November, the end date could be December 31st or March 31st. And then we just have that reminder that the authos can't go beyond June 30th or September 30th. So I see Emily has her hand up. So Emily, you can go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So I just had a quick question on that. I know that we are wanting to end these on these quarterly end dates so that we can keep our budget up to date. And I had actually asked, and I had heard differently, so I want to make sure I hear this right. Let's say that I have a student who is doing a class starting July 1st, and the class is going to end July 14th. I was told that I could actually end it July 14th instead of ending it on 9/30. Is that right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. If you know that it's a defined period of time, then use that start and end date. If you're authorizing an hourly service and you're not sure when the person might complete those hours, then I would go out to that quarterly end date. But
Okay.
if you know it's going to start here and end here, yes, by all means, go ahead and use those start and end dates.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Eric.
So, the end dates for, the state fiscal year and the federal obviously make some sense, but we have potentially a couple items on our contracts and pre-ets that for camps, so like Emily's talking about something with a specific start and end date. What if they interfere with those particular end dates? So I guess the most recent example I have is with one of our partners. Career Solutions has a camp that started on the 21st of June and ends July 22nd.
Okay.
And so on the contract, it's a bulk rate for that camp, but obviously, we have to authorize it, at least at the start of the camp, if not prior to that, obviously, for encumbering funds. But then, it doesn't end till July. So, do we did one auth, or I did one auth for students participating in that, but I always have felt like the September, the federal fiscal year, is a little, maybe I'm wrong, but just seems more concrete and like definitive. But what about those scenarios if we have something that's going to kind of overlap both those time periods?
Yep. So, in the example that you're going through or explaining, when the vendor has one of those camps or classes that crosses over, but they're going to bill in one lump sum. So they're not billing us at an hourly rate. If, the camp is billed $1,500 for the whole camp, then it can cross over. That's fine. It's really when they're billing us just per hour, that's when we need to be more mindful of the end dates. So if they're going to bill just one lump sum because the training as a whole is $1,500, that's the amount we're going to pay no matter what, then it can cross over.
Okay.
So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that seems pretty concrete. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and I see a question in the chat. We end dates on quarters, but encourage invoicing monthly. Correct. When we're authorizing, we are authorizing, usually for a 3-month time period. We do ask the vendors to invoice monthly. That's just so everybody's kind of on the same page and know, okay, if I created an authorization for 10 hours, it's another way for us to keep track of how many hours have been used if they submit an invoice every month instead of waiting until the end. And then there's a comment that it's very overwhelming when groups come in this way. Do you mean when you get invoices for group sessions and then the invoices are coming every month?
Okay, I'm just going to explain.
Sure.
So most of my services have been groups, and I have received waves of invoices coming in every month. And I have been going through them again because they're just very messy looking.
Mhm.
And I can see places where I've made some mistakes and I need to get those taken care of. But when you have groups of people, and I've only got a couple schools right now, but on my caseload, I have 25. So the couple schools I have coming in right now and sending me these huge waves of invoices monthly is becoming very time consuming and very difficult to track on a monthly basis. And what I'm running into is it's additionally hard to track when we're splitting up those hours over these end dates. And I don't know if anybody out there has a better way of seeing all this. Like, I don't even know how to explain this. I'm just like visual. I need to see it all in one spot.
Sure.
And tracking it over these four documents or whatever that I'm trying to keep track of is it's overwhelming. So I guess I was wondering, like, is it okay if they invoice on quarters, or I'm just kind of looking towards the future when I have 25 schools and I've got, let's just say I have 25 groups of students and all this stuff is coming at me at once, and how I'm tracking these hours over, we have 4 hours in this quarter and then we got to switch over to the next quarter, and trying to keep track of all that stuff because we have to make new authorizations. Are you following me?
Yep, I totally understand. And, I wish I had some great solutions or advice for you. What I will say is I know that a lot of our vendors do bill monthly. That's just how they do business.
Okay.
So we don't really dictate that they have to bill monthly, or, I mean, I'll be honest, we have some vendors that aren't necessarily the greatest at invoicing either, and they don't bill every month. So it's kind of about the provider and what their business practice is. I would encourage, I know in the role that you guys are in, you're serving a lot of, you're serving the same individuals statewide. I realize you might be working with different community partners, but you can most certainly share tips and tricks and what's working for you to track all of this. I know there is a lot to keep track of. But what I will say is we don't tell the vendors they must submit an invoice every month. So if it works that maybe it's easier to not have them do that, I think it's something you could have a conversation about perhaps.
Okay, because I felt like at one time we were told you should be having them invoice us monthly. Just so things can get paid out and everybody's, we're keeping things flowing. But yeah, I have this concern that being my caseload is gonna probably get in the hundreds, and I have them coming in, monthly. I feel like I'm gonna run into a lot more of those like MS-16s because I'm just having trouble tracking this authorization, and then, hey, it hits June 30th. I got to make sure these are all reauthed and they're not overlapping hours. And
Yeah.
maybe that's just me. I don't know, but
No, I think what you're describing happens more than I think it happens to a lot of staff that are trying to track pre-ETS, and it's kind of new for all of us. And
right.
I think it's just kind of finding what works for you to keep track of everything. So,
Well, if anybody has a really good system, let me know.
yeah. Okay. So I just have a couple of comments in the chat that I'm going to go to. Isn't there an accounting based on vendor in Swift for a time period on encumbrance or PO? I don't know if I understand the statement.
Sorry, I just mean like isn't there a report we can run in Swift on the vendor that shows how much time is left in the encumbrance that we authorized, you know,
Yeah. Yep.
so that we don't have to keep it a separate accounting in an Excel spreadsheet, that we can say, okay, there's this many hours left when we're
Yeah,
comparing.
there's not quite a report to that level. You can run a report that'll show the authorizations that you've created, and it'll show if there are payments made or not paid against those authorizations. But it doesn't quite get into the detail of the hours. It's more, it'll show you what the original authorized amount is, and it'll show you any payments that have been made. So it'll kind of show you what the balance left on the authorization is, but it doesn't keep track of the hours for you. So a big part of this is how many hours do we have for service? How many hours do we have for prep? How many hours do we have for travel? Those are flexible in that when you have the original conversation, we know that things can change as the providers start working with the participants. So, we can adjust how the hours are allocated, but if they need new hours or more hours, we'd have to create a new authorization.
So one more question, I'm new to this. So in Swift, like what you're saying, the transportation and the each of the under the encumbrance, there's not an object code that's assigned to transportation or each of the work-based learning. No, okay,
Not for pre-ETS, no.
okay.
Okay, so then the next question, how do you suggest we authorize for work experience wages that cross over the state fiscal end dates? So we have to, because that is billed hourly, it has to end, on June 30th or September 30th, and then new authorizations are created on July 1st or 10/1 for the hours that are going to be needed. And then someone's asking, is the term provider and vendor separate or interchangeable? And they are interchangeable. So, we call them providers, we call them vendors. They're all the same. They're those community partners that we're creating authorizations for services to. Okay, I'm going to keep going. I think I have all the questions. I see Eric has his hand up, but that might have been from before. Okay, we're going to keep going. So date changes. Pre-ETS authorizations will not be extended beyond the end date. New authorizations can be put in place if services will be continuing. Really, the only time we would extend an end date is to avoid an MS-16. Otherwise, we're always going to create a new authorization on the quarterly start dates for the hours that are needed. Okay, and then increases for services. If additional units of service are needed, we always have to do a new authorization, and we cannot add hours to an existing authorization. So when you create an authorization, if it's for 20 hours, that's the most we can get out of that one authorization. If the provider needs more than 20 hours, we have to create a new authorization for those hours. Okay. So that was kind of a review of the authorizing piece. I'm going to launch another poll, and this one is a true false. I have 8 questions, and we are going to do this poll. After the poll, then we will take a little break, and then we'll come back and finish up the training. So I'm going to launch this poll, 8 true false questions, and I will give you a few minutes to work on this. I'm going to pause the recording. So the first question was, I'll share the results here. Okay, pre-ETS services are always authorized at $75 an hour. That one is true. Number 2, Create's group services are invoiced at $75 an hour. That is false. If it's group services, they'll be invoiced at $30 an hour. Number 3, the first meeting is included in prep time. That is true. Number 4, the community partner can bill for time to attend an IEP meeting. That is true. Number 5, VRS can pay up to 75% of service time for prep time. And that is false. And I don't even know if I talked about it, but the vendor can only pay, we can only pay up to 50% of service time for prep time. Good job, guys. Number 6, the community partner cannot invoice for time writing reports. That is true. And number 7, the federal fiscal year starts on July 1st. That one is false. The federal fiscal year starts October 1st. And then number 8, VR staff can add hours to an existing authorization. You guys are rock stars. That is false. So thank you for participating in that. I think now is a good time to take a break. Oh, so someone asked me to explain number 3. The first meeting is included in prep time, which is true. First meeting, oh, it's false. The first meeting is included in service time. So I'm sorry, I probably did say true and it's false and you guys all got it right. So I apologize. You guys were on track. I was not paying attention. So thank you for letting me know. So yes, number 3, the first meeting is included in prep. That is false. It is considered service time. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing. It is 10:42. So if we could come back at, let's say 10:50, so about an 8-minute break. And then we will get through the rest of our material. And I'm still hoping to get you out of here by noon. I think we'll still get done a little early. So 10:50, we will come back together. And I'm gonna share my screen. So this whole morning, we've talked about kind of the front end, the steps that we need to take to get the funds encumbered for the purchases. So now we're going to talk about how we pay for the goods and services that we authorize. So in order to make a payment in Workforce One to the community provider, there needs to be a purchase order. And essentially what happens is when we create the authorization in Workforce One, we're creating that before the services or goods are purchased or take place. What the authorization does is it feeds over to SWIFT, which is our state accounting system, and it assigns the authorization a purchase order number. So every authorization has to be tied to a person. So that's why, you know, you're creating authorizations against each individual. And this is how we track the money that we've spent. It's really important that we work with the CRPs and LUVs to ensure that before they provide the service, that they have an authorization. That the dates of the service and the service provided are listed on every invoice, and that the actual dates of service and the number of units or hours that are provided are included on the reports. So for the invoices, the invoice has to show the dates of service, and that can be a date range. So if, for example, the vendor, the community partner invoices us monthly, and let's say their first date of service was May 5th, and their last day of service was May 29th, the invoice can show that May 5th through May 29th. The report is going to itemize what day the service happened and for how many hours. The invoice has to have a unique invoice number. And this is because when we make the payment, SWIFT requires an invoice number for each payment. So we can't use the same invoice number to make multiple payments. The invoice should include the authorization number. It needs to have the type of service, the number of units, and the cost per unit. For the group services, the number of students who participated in the group service each day. And then every invoice has to have the remit to address for the provider, for the community partner. And that's so we can verify that this is where you need your payment to go. So that it has to have their address. And then it's really important that we date stamp invoices. And the date stamp is important because we have 30 days from when an invoice is received to make payment to the vendor. So some vendors, let's say they create their invoices on the 1st of the month, May 1st. If we don't get it until May 15th, that's already 14 days that have gone by. And if we didn't date stamp it to say we received it on May 15th, it would look like we had been sitting on that invoice for almost 2 weeks, and that would eat up our 30-day clock. So that's why the date stamp is really important. So when we get an invoice, the invoice is going to come to us and it's going to come with a report. And your role is to review the invoices and to review the reports. So when you sign off on an invoice, you're saying that those services have been received. They were provided to the person, how you arranged it with the provider. And you're signing off on the invoice to say, yeah, it's okay to pay this invoice. I have the report. I know that the service happened and it happened how I arranged it with the vendor. Every invoice requires 2 signatures. So one is an approval signature from a pre-ETS rehab rep or a counselor. And then the second signature is from our support staff. They put a payment sticker on every invoice and they have to put some coding on there. And when they make the payment, they also sign the payment sticker. And anybody that signs an invoice has to have that signature authority, which is that delegation from your manager. So we've talked a little bit about the invoices. Now we're going to talk about the reports. So before you approve an invoice, you need to verify that all of the services have been received. And the way that you're going to do that is by reviewing the report. So any invoice that we receive requires a report. The report that's submitted to VRS must include the following. So it has to have a description of the services that were provided with sufficient detail to give VRS a good picture of what took place. The report is going to show the actual date that the service was provided. It's going to show the number of hours that were provided for each date of service. If the services are not complete, a partial report can be submitted for the services provided to date. The report needs to show the actual dates and times for the services, the prep time, employer development, team meetings, transportation time. So the report is really where all the detail is. For transportation, the report has to show the starting location, the destination, and the ending location. If a provider provided transportation for more than one student, the report should note how many other students were picked up in the city they were picked up in. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. So I think a lot of you have, been working in your roles and you've seen invoices that have come in, reports that have come in. So what we're going to do in your handout on pages 5 through 10 are, I believe it's like 5 different invoice scenarios. So there's 6. So I'm going to give you some time to review them. And I'm going to launch a poll and it'll just say, yes or no, like, would you approve these for payments or whatever I have in the questions in the scenarios. So I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, so scenario 1, Midwest Special Services, assuming we had a report, would you okay this invoice for payment? Answers in the poll were the majority said yes. I did have a few that said no. So the correct answer on this one is no. Does anyone want to share why they think no?
Is it because the units aren't listed? That's
No.
not why.
No. So for this one, what's missing, and I see something in the chat, the address, exactly. So this one does not have a complete remit to address. So there's no way to confirm the address of Midwest Special Services on the invoice to what we would have in Workforce One. So this one I said no, because the remit to address is not complete. Number 2, this is from LifeWorks. So for this one, I'm gonna make it a little smaller. We have an invoice and a report. So what are we thinking about this? I will say in the poll, the majority of you said no, we would not approve this invoice. Does anyone want to share why? No is the correct answer. And I'm seeing some stuff in the chat about the wrong dates. The service dates don't match. You guys are right on. So on the invoice, they say the dates of service are February 3rd and February 19th. But on the report, it says February 5th and February 19th. So in this situation, we would need to get either an updated invoice or an updated report for the correct dates of service. So good job there. Number 3, this is a report. And we received an invoice for the 1.5 hours of Priyat's introductory work activities. So the question is asking, are all the hours on the report billable? And this one, I had 100%. Everybody is saying no, they are not. And what's not a billable hour on this report? Yes, and I see in the chat, the vendor can't bill for the waiting time or this no-show. So right here, the participant did not show up for the meeting and they're trying to bill us a half an hour. And they're not able to do that. Okay, number 4. We received this invoice and report. Do the invoice and the report meet the requirements for the February 1st date of service? I'll just move things down a little bit. So on this one, the majority of you said yes, and that is correct. So this invoice, along with this report, this meets everything that we need to get the vendor paid. I mean, they're even billing us, it looks like for a half hour of travel, and they're telling us the starting location, the ending location. So that's all exactly what we need. So then in the chat, it says we don't need the location address. Let me see. I don't know that, and we can review this in the authorization guide, but I think we kind of narrowed it down to like a city. I don't know that they have to give us the complete address, just to allow a little flexibility. Yeah. So we'll review that in a second. Number 5, does the following report meet the criteria for travel? And again, you guys, 100% of you said, no, it does not. And the reason being on this one is there is no starting or ending location. So they're adding travel to all these different dates of service, but they're not telling us where they're starting and where they're going. So for this one, you guys rocked it. No, that report would need to be updated. And then the last one, an invoice and a report. So would we approve this one? And the majority of you said yes on this one as well. And I would agree. The vendor does a nice job of showing the dates and the services that were provided. This vendor kind of goes a little above and beyond, and they're even itemizing out the prep time versus the service time. But all of the hours on the invoice are accounted for in the report. So that is a good invoice and report. So I have a question. What about the type and title? Type title in the report. Maybe I need a little help with the question. So what about the type title in the report?
Well, shouldn't it say on the report that it was, I don't have my glasses on, whatever the type and title is they're doing on the invoice?
Yes, I mean, ideally, the report is going to confirm the service that was provided.
Yeah, just because I don't see it, that exact thing on the.
Yeah, and this could be part, the examples that I pulled, because I believe this provider actually enters a case note in Workforce One, so it's very possible the
That's
case
right.
note category they selected was the pre-ETS service. So
Yeah, I figured it was Goodwill.
Yeah.
They do. So, okay, yeah.
Yep.
Then I'd pay it.
Okay. Okay, prep time billed at $30 for individual, not 75. Are you, okay, so Jennifer, are we still talking about this invoice?
Yeah, I'm just curious. I know it's a group activity and you'd bill the classroom time at $30, but if you're preparing prep time on a specific individual, would it be $75 an hour or the 30?
Well, if the service was provided to a group, everything gets billed at the group rate. So the prep time and the service time all comes at the group rate of $30 an hour.
Okay, because it said they were researching the student, so I just thought it was individualized. But okay, you're saying that just do it as a group. Okay.
Yeah, yep. Okay, I'm gonna close that. Okay, so, and I think you've probably all experienced some of this, but the invoices and the reports that we receive from providers vary from provider to provider. They're all going to look a little different. Vendors are going to kind of do things their way, like how they prepare things. So just know that things are going to look a little different based on the provider. If at any time you have questions about an invoice or a report or things like that, I encourage you to consult with your manager. You can consult with your field operations specialist. I know Alyssa Klein is always available for consult as well. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to go over those sample invoices and reports with us. So just a couple of reminders. When the vendor submits an invoice, the hours invoiced cannot exceed the hours that were authorized for each item. So the service time, the prep time, and the travel time. So before you authorize, you're going to be entering your case note that kind of indicates how many hours were allotted for service time, prep time, travel time. Now, there is flexibility in that, but you need to be updating your case notes to indicate how the hours are being used. So, for example, if initially you had an authorization for 10 hours, 5 hours for service time, 3 hours, or let's say 2 hours for prep and 3 hours for travel, and something changed and maybe they needed an hour of travel and not an hour of service time, you can adjust those and you would just case note the situation and what's happening. The bottom line is the most we can pay though is 10 hours between those 3: service, prep, or travel. So just make sure to get your case notes up to date. If the vendor needed more than 10 hours, then we would need a new authorization. I encourage you to review your authorizations as each quarterly end date nears to see which authorizations are ending and to have that conversation with the provider about creating new authorizations and what might be needed coming up. Okay. So we've covered the big parts. Getting the authorizations created. We've talked about how to find those PT contracts, what the vendors have available for the different services. The last thing we need to talk about is we do have a few authorizations that might fall in this pre-ETS auxiliary aid category. And what those auxiliary aids are things like sign language interpreters, communication devices like an FM system, video remote interpreting, cart or remote cart services, communication boards, and note takers. Auxiliary aids and services for effective communication are the services that make spoken, written, or oral information accessible to individuals with hearing or visual impairments, or that assist an individual with a speech impairment in communicating. So we have different master contracts through the state of Minnesota. Basically what that means is we've negotiated certain services with specified vendors for goods and services. Any state agency can purchase from those contracts. And what the contract does is it indicates a pre-negotiated rate for that service. So we have exclusive contracts and non-exclusive contracts. Exclusive contracts mean we're required to purchase that service or good from that contract. And when staff review contracts, there'll be language on there that says this contract must be used by all state agencies unless a specific exception is granted by the acquisition specialist. Otherwise, there'll be what we call a non-exclusive contract, which just means the contract is available, but we're not required to use it. Why this is important is because we have exclusive contracts for sign language interpreting, the video remote interpreting, CART, and hearing aids, which our hearing aid contract is how we purchase the FM systems. So if you happen to be working with a participant who needs any of these services, just know that we have an exclusive state contract that we need to use. So when you're in a situation where you might need to purchase one of those auxiliary aids, just remember that it's important to check to see if the item that they need is available on a state contract. The support staff in your local office, they are all really well versed in how to look up the contracts, how to interpret the contracts, know what is on a contract. So I would encourage you to work with the support staff in your local office. Again, if the item is on an exclusive contract, we have to purchase from that contract regardless of the price. And like I said, work with your support staff to make those purchases. So we have made it through the majority of our content. So I'm going to spend a little time just doing a little review. So it's really important that we make sure funds are prior encumbered. So always making sure that before the service happens or before the goods are purchased, we have an authorization that's been issued in Workforce One. You're going to want to make sure to check those community partner contracts. That's how you know which services the vendors offer. You're going to take time to review your invoices and reports as they're received. And then there's some additional resources that are available to you on SharePoint. So the first one is the Pre-ETS Desk Aid. We looked at this earlier, but it's just this nice little desk aid that kind of, reminds you what the different Pre-ETS services are. It gives examples of the different types of services that fall in each category. And then again, on the right-hand side is the services that we're able to authorize for when it comes to Pre-ETS. Your service type and title sheet. So this is really helpful when you're creating authorizations. So this shows you on the left-hand side, all the different service types. And I'm just going to scroll here for a second. So here are all the different Pre-ETS service types. And then these are the service titles. So these are the different service titles that we use when we create the authorizations in Workforce One. So this is kind of a nice little desk aid that I always tell staff to have ready at their fingertips. The next one is this authorizing, reporting, and invoicing guide. So this is the one that I would encourage you to go to if you ever have a question about authorizing, about the invoices or the reports. And here it is. So this also is the document that was shared with the community partners. So they got the same information that our VRS staff have. Within this document, there's other resources that have been identified. There's this pre-employment transition services PT contract definitions. This just, gives more information about the services, what they are, what's included in those service types. I'm going to keep scrolling down. So here's that rate structure. Again, it reminds us that everything is authorized for individuals. If it's a one-to-one service, it's authorized and invoiced at $75 an hour. If it's a service provided to a group, it's authorized at $75, but invoiced at $30 an hour. Here's the reminder about, before you authorize, you're going to have that conversation with the community partner about how many hours are needed, how much is service time, how much is prep time, how much is travel. Here's our reminder about those authorization end dates. I'm going to keep going here. Here's more information about how they can bill for their pre-ETS time. So we talked about this before, the service time, what's included in service time, what's included in prep time, what's included in travel. Gives a little more guidance about authorizing for work experiences. I'm just gonna scroll through this. But I do want to hit, there are some examples towards the end that I think are helpful, and they kind of came up throughout our conversations today. I would just point you back to this desk aid. It gives some really nice scenarios about how the authorization is created, what the invoices and reports need to look like. And then there's that additional guidance about the travel. So she gives some different examples about transportation and how that is authorized. So that is your authorizing and reporting and invoicing guide. There's also an invoice and report checklist. This is just nice, when you're newer to reviewing invoices or reports, it really just walks you through all the things that you should be thinking about when you're reviewing an invoice or reviewing a report. So it's not required, but it's a nice little desk aid that kind of just gives you those prompts to think, okay, did I review this? Do we have this? So that's called the VRS invoice and report checklist. And then the last item is on SharePoint. There is a page dedicated to transition. Hopefully you're familiar with this page, but there's this purple button here that says pre-ETS. Again, that's where you're going to find that authorizing and reporting invoicing guide, the definitions, the desk aid. This pre-ETS FAQ is amazing. I go to it all of the time. Alyssa keeps this current. It is quite long. I think there's it says 46 pages. So if you have questions about pre-ETS, I would first encourage you to go to this FAQ. Odds are that someone has asked the question and it's out here. So that, oops, let me go back. So that's on this transition page. The training, so the training that we're doing today, you're gonna see a link It'll have the PowerPoint and the recording out there for you. And then any other recordings or trainings that I've done previously, those are out here available for you to look at. So there's a question in the chat. Can I point out again where the type and title sheet is? If you go to forms, it's under S and then service type and titles. And whenever you want to open a form on SharePoint, you always click on the form number and it will open that for you. There it is. Okay. That is the end of this training session. Are there any final questions? Comments? If not, that is going to conclude our training today. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to join me this morning. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or call me in Teams. Use those resources that are available. So I thank you all for attending and I hope you have a great rest of your day. What I will do though, is I am also going to send out an evaluation. So it'll be a form. I'll just send it in an email. It'll link you to a form and you can give me some feedback about the training session today. So thank you all for joining me.